This is JadeCast, your gateway to traditional martial arts and Chinese culture. Brought to you by your host, Shifu Jonathan Bluestein. Hello everyone and welcome back to JadeCast. Thank you for being with us once more. Today I bring you Shifu Dennis Mace, a colleague of mine, an expert in the practice and teaching of the art of Bagua Zhang, specializing in Cheng style Bagua Zhang, a really interesting subset of the art, and one of a handful of experts for this art and substyle in North America. You know, I was thinking Dennis and I were going to primarily discuss this interesting martial art on this podcast interview, but as commonly happens in our interviews on JadeCast, we sort of sidetracked into all sorts of other interesting areas of discussion, such as racism and how we can handle racism and try to mitigate its effects with martial arts practice and teachings, martial arts culture in North America versus China, history, politics, scientific research, and whatnot. So, without further ado, here's the interview, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. Shifu Dennis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be here. I'm really honored. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you, and you are a veteran practitioner and teacher of the Chinese arts. Shifu Dennis is from the Washington State area. And just let us know, Dennis, how long have you been in the arts, generally speaking?
Oh, gosh, 30 some years. I started when I was 12. I'm 50 now, so 38 years or something like that.
Well, if you could see his skin on video, I think this is a good testament for the power of the internal arts, because he looks at least 10 years younger.
Well, the video that I have, I really need to record some more video, because the video that I have up right now is like at least 10 years old, and I cringe every time that I see it. So
aren't we all like that among martial arts teachers? It's never good enough.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so you started out, if I remember correctly, at Sifu Starr's school, right?
That's the second place. I started with judo and jiu-jitsu in about 82 or 83, and I did that for a couple of years, and then I got into Chinese martial arts. So that's when I got into Chinese martial arts, was in 1985.
And how old were you then?
I was only 15.
I see.
So.
All right. And you know what, as a martial arts teacher nowadays, and not intending to bash on any instructor, because everybody's got to make a living and the culture is different than what it was back in the 1980s. But I think a lot of instruction has, we could say, soften up a little, right?
Yeah, I agree. And it's definitely, it doesn't seem like martial arts in some regards is as popular as it was, but then it's also more pervasive. It's like in everything that we do, but fewer people are actually practicing. It's kind of a weird dichotomy, I think.
Yeah, and I was specifically aiming at the kids scene, like what was going on back then with judo and jiu-jitsu and even Chinese martial arts for children and young adults. So how do you see the difference? How was it back then?
Oh, it just seemed like a lot more people were really committed to training back then. It really did seem like a different kind of attitude that people. It's kind of interesting with technology. We have a lot more information at our fingertips, but at the same time, everyone's busier and more distracted, and they don't seem to have the time to commit to something that takes a lot of effort and dedication and time to develop a skill in like martial arts. So everyone's more interested in instant gratification, and and martial arts takes a lot of time to cultivate. So
Definitely, yes, I agree. But you know, with children, they don't even choose. Oftentimes, they don't even choose how much time they're going to put into the practice. They're in part guided by the parents. So I would assume that parents back in the day, in 1980s, had different goals in mind for what their children are going to get from martial arts classes as compared with today. So how was it back in your time when you were a kid?
Well, for me personally, when I was first getting into martial arts, I was kind of an introverted kid, and I was really artistic, interested in Asian cultures and things. And when I first started getting into it, I was interested in the self-expression and everything, but also the self-defense, and not just school situation, but even at home. I had some kind of unsavory characters around when I was growing up. And it just seemed like something that you had to do to take care of yourself. And nowadays, contrasting that with now, I think the biggest threat that a lot of kids are facing right now is, the pervasiveness of kind of racist attacks seem to be on the rise in the last few years, which I'm really concerned about, even for my own children, because my son is 19, my daughter's 14, and I have stepchildren, and they're also in their teens and 20s, and I'm, concerned with the spike in racist kind of violence that's been happening in especially the last 4 or 5 years. It just seems to be going on everywhere, not just in any particular locale. It's very troubling, I think, right now. And so I think for a lot of people, they're, maybe turning towards martial arts right now for self-defense with that. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like a lot of people are really willing to put in the time and the effort like they used to back in the day. And in the United States, it doesn't really seem like it's a sustainable, to keep a brick and mortar school open in the United States. It's incredibly expensive, especially around here in the Pacific Northwest. Just in order to keep a school open, it's almost not affordable anymore. Just realistically speaking.
Culturally, what you're saying is very interesting to me as someone who grew up in Israel, lived most of his life there, where we of course have to deal with racism, as is the case in many countries around the world, but it's not as severe as in North America, I think. And it's interesting because if we look at movies, even martial arts related movies, action flicks and such, there is far more diversity nowadays in terms of different ethnicities, different races. So in the mainstream culture, it doesn't look like there's a problem, but then on the street there is one.
Yeah, it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that's happening right now. It in some ways it seems it doesn't make sense, but that kind of bullying and aggravated assaults, there's just something happening with people right now that some people are just very angry about different groups, and they just can't seem to reconcile it with whatever they're being fed in the media or whatever, with political leaders. They just buy into this kind of hate mongering that's going around, and unfortunately too many people are acting on it. So
if you were to ask me, I think we're all in 20th and 21st century societies. We have this crisis with tribalism, but also our own place within tribes, because we have lost our traditional tribal structure, most of us, not all of us. And I feel that the more stress there is in society, the more those different people feeling that they belong to many, many, many more different tribes feel this need to compete with one another, or even falsely believe that they need to so-called, quote unquote, attack the other tribe. And in this sense, I feel that maybe martial arts schools can be part of the cure, because they can provide for a tribe that's accepting, that doesn't have those biases, hopefully, in terms of ethnicity, race, gender, etc.
Yeah, I believe in that. And that's the kind of atmosphere that I try to cultivate in my own classes as well, is this kind of open acceptance and respect for all life, because that's really, to me, at the heart of all martial arts, really. I mean, even the Chinese character for Wu is to stop conflict, not to perpetuate it. And to me,
sorry, Shifu Dennis just mentioned the character for Wu for martial.
Yeah. And it's an ideogram for stopping a halberd. It's for stopping conflict and stopping war. So it's not about the proliferation of violence. It's about ending it. And at the core of that is a respect for life. So the real warrior doesn't have a bloodthirst for the sake of their own grandeur. It's all about protecting life and peace and harmony. So that's really, for me, the root of the meaning behind martial arts, and all the respect and Buddha and everything else comes out of that. So,
that's beautiful, man. And I'm glad that we got into this discussion that we did not plan on, but we got a bit sidetracked. So let's go back to, you start out with these Japanese styles and you moved into the Chinese arts. So how did that come about?
As I was getting into the martial arts, I was seeing a lot of Bruce Lee and Kung Fu theater, and I really loved that kind of expression. And so that's what I really wanted. And I found judo. I loved judo because it was very practical, and the ideas of being able to take someone's balance and increase your own, and learning how to fight even on the ground. It's very pragmatic. And when Omaha Kung Fu Institute opened up, I was just really excited, and I begged my parents to go, and they finally relented. and I loved it. And the background in judo, I feel, was really helpful in understanding martial arts, especially since so much of the root of most martial arts is in shuaijiao. I think that grappling aspect is really helpful and important for most people.
Yes, and I think it's worth noting that in Chinese martial arts culture, shuaijiao is so essential. It's taken to be such a core foundational sort of skill that a lot of people don't even refer to it as a martial art, but rather as a skill that all martial artists in Chinese traditions ought to learn.
Yeah, and I hear a lot of people. Some people will say it's its own separate thing, it's its own separate system, its own separate art or sport. But it really is. I agree. It's really at the root of any kind of martial art, even if predominantly what you're training is a striking art. Still, the fundamentals of balance and structure and taking someone's balance are still critical in understanding even how those pugilistic kind of striking arts really work and what make them really effective. It's all related,
Well, if I think of say two silverback gorillas fighting, then I think there's more of a striking element there than grappling. But with humans, it's not exactly the same, because evolutionarily speaking, if we look at young children, the first thing they do is, in terms of sport, is wrestle.
Yeah, grab each other and try and shake each other around and throw the other one down.
Exactly. And they're looking to wrestle with other males in the household or in the family. And in some way, we could posit that perhaps striking is not necessarily superior to grappling, but it's a more advanced or maybe a later development in human evolution.
Yeah, it could be. That could be true. Yeah, I think it's kind of difficult to say exactly, because all of these arts and every different culture are so refined, and they were refined so long ago, that trying to piece together really how far back it goes. I mean, even, the ancient Greeks, they had really advanced methods of combat, and it wasn't just this brutal kind of warfare. Like, every culture has their roots in something that was really refined. And Chinese martial arts as well. I think the one thing that separates the Asian martial arts is, for some reason, they culturally kind of codified things and kept it more intact, and those traditions are still more with us, give or take. Even like one of my students and I were having a discussion earlier this week, literally about some Viking traditions that are, kind of overlooked, and even, culturally, they were kind of dismissed as being barbarians and uncultivated, but their culture and even their martial culture was very developed. And I think most of it has just been kind of lost to history. But for some reason, Asian martial arts managed to keep some of the heritage and lineage there. Even European fencing, Italian, Spanish fencing, that have very systemic methods of development. Most of those traditions have been lost. There are still a few teachers out there that teach them, but it's pretty rare. And I think it's probably easier to find Filipino martial arts nowadays than it is to find Spanish fencing, like authentic Spanish fencing.
Indeed,
it's kind of interesting.
I think we often fail to give enough credit to those ancient traditions. But if we think about it, these people often trained harder than modern professional MMA fighters. They were professional soldiers in Greek and Roman militaries. They were at it 24 hours a day. They wouldn't just do their weapons fighting and empty-handed fighting. They would also be hunting and foraging for food and building camp. They would exercise all day long. And these people had to take care of each other's bodies. So they're their own physical therapists and massage therapists. I mean, it's famous that the Greek wrestlers and boxers, after they had their matches, they would give massages to each other with oil and medicinal herbs. And in some ways, there is the idea that we are very similar in our modern Western culture to the Greeks and the Romans, but it's only true to an extent, because they had a culture of worshiping the human body, the human form, not in a religious sense, but in a cultural sense. So they were not afraid of touch and of physical intimacy. And nowadays, I think one of the good things that traditional martial arts schools bring to the table is that we're permitted to socially groom each other, like apes groom each other. So we do push hands in any art. That's if we do it gently, it's almost like social grooming, and that's something that we really need energetically, socially, psychologically, and it's lost on us because say if we were to sit at a cafe and we are just acquainted with someone from the neighborhood, the natural human thing to do is maybe to help them comb their hair or stroke them if they're feeling down. But nowadays we feel such tension between one another because maybe that would be thought of as harassment. Maybe I'm gonna come across as as a creep or as a molester or whatever. Like, it's very difficult to bring across your intentions, but in martial arts schools that is possible.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think that martial arts can be really helpful to people in a lot of ways, and on that point, even people that have been attacked and people that have been assaulted, I feel like martial arts can help people to not just help them become more confident, but also to be able to create healthy boundaries, and not just to protect themselves, but to help them heal with the concept of touch after they've been violated and their boundaries have been attacked. They can learn how to protect themselves, and that also gives them a way, even in class and in training, it gives them kind of the space to kind of heal the traumas that were created by attack. And my wife is a mental health counselor, and she also we talk sometimes about the trauma and the post-traumatic stress that comes out of all these different kinds of situations. And I believe that martial arts is really helpful for a lot of people for healing in that sense. So that's a really excellent point.
So maybe this is actually a sort of a gateway for a lot of people nowadays in the martial arts. I've been thinking about this in recent years. Maybe a lot of us teachers make the mistake of trying to bring people in with 1980s, 1990s mentality, whilst actually maybe we should start from the healing point of view, and then draw them into the real traditional instruction after they've been introduced into the art via this alternative route.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So going back on, so I'm interested in Sifu Pete Starr's school, because he's an interesting character and he has a very interesting system. So please tell us about both.
Well, let's see. When I first met Sifu Starr, I was 15, and I was really struck with his kind of in the school. He had a strong sense of like family, and he was very down to earth and approachable. He taught his classes with kind of a healthy, but maybe healthy sense of humor, but maybe a little bit inappropriate jokes. And it just made it brought a sense of levity to the training, because we would train pretty seriously and pretty hard, and we thump each other, we hit each other pretty hard sometimes in the training, and throws and takedowns, and training sometimes till exhaustion and everything. Like traditional Kung Fu, one of the sayings that he would use in the class when you're training like this Mabu horse stance training is, it's okay to fall down. That just means your legs are weak, but it's not okay to stand up, because that just means your spirit's weak. So, so there'd be a lot of jokes in class, but we would train pretty hard, and that was one of the things that I really appreciated. There was definitely a progressive structure in the instruction, and we trained really hard and learned a lot, and a lot of good solid foundational principles to the way that we trained, and everything was focused on keeping everything practical, and good body mechanics and timing and balance. And the heart of the system that he taught was keeping and maintaining your center. And so using that as the fundamental foundational principle that he used to he used to kind of bring together the different systems of like Xingyi and Tai Chi and Bagua, but the foundation of it and the root of it was to everything beginning and ending from your center, staying focused on your physical center of gravity, 1 point, or your center, lower dantian. And so everything moving from there.
So the primary systems he taught were essentially Xingyi, Taiji, and Bagua?
Yeah, and there was a lot of emphasis or a lot of influence from some other kind of what he called Shaolin systems. And I know that he had an extensive background in karate, that I think he utilized some of his background in karate where everything is very structured and progressively driven, so that when in Chinese martial arts, there's kind of a tendency for the training to be haphazard and kind of all over the place. You do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and one day you're doing one thing and another day you're doing something completely different. And it's just kind of like this messy, big, giant spider web of stuff that you're trying to feel in the dark through and what's going on. But the way that he would teach everything is he applied a ranking system so that the material would be structured so that as you went through it, everything kind of foundations and layers that would help you progress, as opposed to everything being very haphazard.
So that's very important when you're dealing with free martial arts, that each has its own vast curriculum. And right. And I do wonder, like, how many ranks did he put in there?
Let me see. So there were, I think there were like 3 grades of, let me see. There was a novice, like a white sash, then yellow, blue, and then I think black, and like really high rank he would call like a red sash. So I guess basically like 5 or 6 ranks, but each one of them had like 3, kind of like grades, like Q within the, I guess is what it's similar to. Is
okay. So you're talking about like maybe 15 in total?
Yeah, something like that. And the thing with me personally is when we were going through the training, I was one of those kind of weird students that I appreciated the ranking system, but I didn't really care. So I would avoid the tests because I just wanted to train. And he saw that passion in me. So he would I would usually go to classes and come to the beginners classes and then stay through advanced classes and weapons classes and everything. And I would just go all the time. And whenever tests would come up, he would try to badger me into taking the tests. And I always tried a way to kind of dodge out of it. So I was just hungry to learn more. I didn't really care about the rank. And
so you mentioned the more hardcore nature of the training. It was intense. Yeah. There was a lot of physical contact, a lot of hitting one another, throwing one another. Do you feel that nowadays things have been brought down a little bit, maybe because of insurance and lawyers and such?
Definitely. There's an aspect to the training where everyone has to be a lot more careful, especially in North America, because of the fear of being sued or something like that. And so it definitely kind of makes instructors be more reticent or more protective about how they teach, what they teach, and not as intense with it. So and so I think it does have a tendency to kind of water down the practice. And
let me ask you something that's a bit baffling for me, again, as someone who comes from different country across the world with different legal paradigm, different approach to martial arts in the culture. So on one hand, you've got what you just described. On the other hand, there's the rise of MMA and BJJ,
Right.
and percentage-wise, the number of people getting injured in such schools is very, very high.
Yeah.
So I do wonder, like, how do you explain that? Do they mind less the insurance issues in BJJ and MMA schools, or is the insurance just far more costly? How does that work?
The insurance is pretty expensive. It is kind of interesting because a lot of the mixed martial arts schools, you do see more injuries, but I'll draw a parallel. One of the schools that I checked out and trained with very, very briefly, they practice some like taijutsu, and the schools are very practical in the way that they taught. But what I saw each time that I went to one of those classes is someone got a broken bone. Oh. So there were kind of, I'm not sure what it was, but it seemed to draw a lot of the kind of alpha male and a lot of belligerent kind of people. And it didn't seem like they were really reeling that in very much. And what the distinction I saw between that training and what I learned with Sifu Starr is that he was able to keep the training very focused and precise and focus on timing, precision, a lot of power, but without people like just flailing around or losing their control and hurting each other. Mm-hmm. And so we would, I mean, people would get, I jam my fingers and, I got my nose busted a few times and, bumps and bruises and, scrapes and all that kind of thing. But I never really saw anyone have a serious injury in class. And we would go at it really hard. But he would still emphasize the ability to control and focus without just going ballistic and just random, like really aggressive, like uncontrolled ego matches with people. And that was one of the really great things, if I look back at the training from Sifu Starr, is that he was able to keep the training focused and train at a level of intensity where people were able to practice without really hurting each other. And I think what's happening with some of the MMA schools is that it tends to draw some of the brawlers and scrappers in class, and some of those people, are maybe, they're a little bit too aggressive and they don't really control themselves or the temper very well, and it lends itself to a lot of injuries because they're not training smart. They'll train hard, but they're not training smart, and there's a difference.
That's a very good point. And you know what? Thinking about what you just said about Sifu Starr, as a colleague, I must say this ability of his is commendable, because you can end up dominating the students too harshly, and that would make you a tyrant. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you can be too lighthearted, too friendly, and then the students end up doing whatever they want, and that can actually lead them into injuring one another. And being right there in the middle, that's a tough point to be at.
Right, exactly. It's definitely a balancing act, but it's really important to strike that balance, to be able to keep the training productive and playful enough to where students are learning, and serious and practical enough to where they're learning something realistic, but not going too far where someone is losing their cool or getting hurt and not understanding where the boundaries are. My judo teacher was really, really good with that as well. Like when I first started, his classes were very well structured. He was incredibly skilled, very practically trained. He was a veteran, like an Army Ranger, and he had a Shotokan karate background and judo background, and he was just very skilled, and he was able to keep a level of comedy and brevity and playfulness in the classes, but also it was very balanced. And so that was one of the aspects that was similar in Pete Starr's classes, is that everything was very kind of a lighthearted attitude, but a very serious training environment. And that it is a difficult balance to strike, but when you can find it, it's great, because sometimes you go into schools and it feels like you're walking into a mortuary. It's like so serious, and no one can like speak to each other or anything, and it's like this really severe military kind of environment. And I personally feel like that's not really conducive to optimal learning for the students. It's good to have focus, but if it's so serious that no one can even ask a question or think or laugh or play, then it makes it really hard to actually learn something valuable. I think there's definitely a balance there when the teacher is able to keep the classes playful but still focused. That's really critical.
Yeah, that's the sweet spot. And you know what? That's the sweet spot you don't get a belt or a ranking for. That's the
right.
Sweet spot. You can't really, there's no curriculum for that. You have to learn it organically, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So eventually you find yourself gravitating a little bit away from Sifu Starr to doing other things. And before you got into your main style, which is Cheng style Bagua Zhang, which we'll talk about later, you had interesting experiences with Aikido, right?
Yeah. I really count myself as being blessed to meet a lot of the instructors that I did. I had moved to Florida briefly, and I was going to go to a Kung Fu school down there, but it was a little bit too far away to be practical. And so I found out about some Aikido school that was down in Florida. And this was about 93, 94. And was introduced to Aikido by an instructor named Grady Lane, who was a very patient, very structured Aikido instructor. He still teaches down in Florida.
Could you kindly repeat his name?
Grady Lane.
Grady Lane Sensei. Okay.
Yep, and he's one of Yamada Sensei's students. Yamada Sensei in New York.
And Yamada Sensei, which branch of Aikido would that be?
I can't remember what it's called. Yamada Sensei is one of O Sensei's disciples, one of the Uchideshi, and he teaches in New York City. I can't remember what the name of the dojo is called, but I respect him a lot. He's got a lot of skill. And then after I was only in Florida for a year, I moved back to Nebraska, and I started training with Sifu Starr again. And I also found another Aikido school in the Omaha area taught by a gentleman named Ronald Christianham. And he really is one of the best examples of a gentleman that I've ever met in my life. His Aikido is very good, and he was very humble gentleman and very friendly, down to earth, great attitude. The school, the training was a lot of fun. I have a huge amount of respect for him. He learned Aikido in Hawaii from some of the Uchideshi that trained there. I can't recall their names, but they were very impressive. He had brought them to Omaha a few times to conduct seminars, and that was a lot of fun. And I also had a brief experience with some training of Aikido when I lived in Indonesia from 2004 to 2006. I was mostly teaching Bagua Zhang there at that time, but I met a really fantastic Aikido instructor there named Manuel Hakim, who lived and trained in Japan for several years. And he had spectacular skill. And he's also still teaching in Jakarta, Indonesia. And what a great guy. He's great attitude, incredible skill, and yeah, that definitely left a lasting impression. And the main reason that I got interested in doing like Aikido, I kind of use it as a supplemental art, was because my first Bagua teacher, Sifu Starr, had talked about the similarities between Bagua Zhang and Aikido. And I definitely agree. There's a lot of structural similarities with the systems, specifically with the concept.
So wait. Let's get into that. Yeah. But let's try to first discuss the history here, because I know that there is a very popular theory that Aikido was in some way affected by Bagua Zhang. In part, this theory was promoted by Shifu Bruce Cormer Francis in his book, The Power of Internal Martial Arts in Chi. And he wrote about this idea that maybe when Ueshiba was in Manchuria, that he had studied some Bagua Zhang there. And then combining this with the traditional jujutsu that he was already quite versed in, that affected the way he moved and taught, and that affected the way Aikido manifested later as a martial art. And some other people claimed, maybe it doesn't make sense because Ueshiba was actually at one point arrested in Manchuria. Maybe he was a soldier there, a spy. So how could he have studied such a thing? Maybe he didn't have enough time. So that's controversial. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
My particular thoughts on that is that the root of what O-sensei taught is Aikido comes from Daitoru Aikijujutsu. And my personal perspective is the influence of whatever root art that Bagua Zhang comes from also somehow influenced Daitoru Aikijujutsu long before Morihei Ueshiba studied the art. And just because foundationally, when you look at how Aikido works on a fundamental level, like the Aikijujutsu, there's so many of the principles and techniques and movements that are so similar between the two systems. And what I'm talking about is the way the systems are applied, the way that you bridge into an opponent's attack, use their momentum against them and turn it back on themselves. It seems to me, from the different Bagua teachers that I've studied with, it seems to me like a fundamental aspect of Bagua Zhang training. And my personal perspective is that I think there's some kind of connection that goes back, whatever system that Deng Haichuan may have learned. I think the root of that may have very likely influenced Aikijutsu somehow, because every traditional Japanese martial art has its foundational root in Chinese martial arts. Just like everything in Japanese culture is its own kind of version of something that's traditionally Chinese. Everything from architecture and writing and painting and arms and armory, martial arts, everything that's traditional Japanese culture has its roots in Han, Tang, Song dynasty Chinese culture. And I think Aikijujutsu specifically has some kind of foundational similarity with whatever art that is at the root of Bagua Zhang, even before perhaps Deng Haichuan had learned it himself. So that's my own, it's conjecture, because historically, how can we really prove it at this point? It's just that you can look at two trees and see this disparity between the two, and they have a common root, but who's to say what exactly it is? At this point, it's kind of conjecture, but when you see two things that are so similar, it's difficult to dismiss that outright and just say, oh, it's just because they both have a root in like swordsmanship, like using a saber. And I think it's more than just this kind of coincidental, kind of haphazard similarity. So I just think that the root is much older than that. And I think it's the influence of it is before O Sensei had studied Aikido Jiu-Jitsu from Takeda family. I think the root of it is older than that. And maybe some Bagua people when he was in China and Manchuria, but I think that the influence in Aikido Jiu-Jitsu it's much older than that. So, because Aikido Jiu-Jitsu was basically started to be taught or practiced sometime in the 17th century, I think is when it started. And, Deng Haichuan didn't start teaching Bagua Zhang publicly until 1850. So I think
19th century, yes.
Right. So I think the roots of both of those systems are somehow there's some kind of cross-pollination that happened before both before O Sensei and for that matter before Deng Haichuan.
Yes. So just to make it a little bit more orderly for some of those listeners who are not as well versed on the history of these arts. So Bagua Zhang is usually attributed to a founder whose name is Deng Haichuan. And Deng Haichuan appeared mysteriously out of the blue. He was a nobody, and suddenly he gets an appointment to work for the imperial family in China, work as a tax collector, work in the palace, teach some bodyguards in the imperial palace in Beijing. And that's mid-19th century. But there is also an understanding that Deng Haichuan is likely not the original founder of Bagua Zhang. It's just that he's the first person to really teach it to larger crowds, audiences. You could say, I mean, he had about 72 students, they say, in Beijing throughout his lifetime, which is quite a lot for a traditional martial art back in the day, because most people would just teach a handful of students. All the while, we have Aikido, which started out as traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. So in the twilight of samurai traditions, when samurai were seldom fighting on a battlefield, and even rarely fighting one-on-one, it wasn't just as common as it used to be in the Middle Ages. Then gradually they started refining their martial arts, what is nowadays called Koryu Bujutsu, the old school martial techniques, or a traditional Jiu-Jitsu. And they added more and more of an empty-handed combat aspect to these arts, because previously, in olden times, the samurai would fight with armor. So there would only be so much you could do empty-handed with an armor. And there's always, weapons lying around. And if you can't get the weapon, someone's gonna get their weapon for you. But then over time, as they spent more time fighting in on streets and in dojos and in challenge matches, more so than on battlefields, and they were commonly not wearing armor, or at least not a heavy armor, then the empty-handed component became more and more dominant, which is why gradually traditional jiu-jitsu had more and more empty-handed fighting. And the specific style called Daito-ryu Aikijutsu is the martial art studied originally by Moye Ueshiba, which he over the years transformed into the martial art of Aikido.
Exactly.
And now I would like to draw a somewhat complex analogy. So I would like to ask the listeners and Shifu Dennis to bear with me for a minute or two here, so I could introduce that sort of metaphor, so we can get into really interesting technical insights. So the art of Bagua Zhang is based conceptually on the Book of Changes. Book of Changes called the I Ching in Chinese. And in the Book of Changes, you have these 8 symbols called the Bagua, 8 trigrams. And these 8 symbols combined can form 64 hexagrams, which are 64 more advanced symbols. But at the core of it all are the 8 trigrams, the Bagua, the 8 core symbols, each of them representing a different type of relationship between yin and yang. So each one of the 8 symbols is made up of 3 lines, and the line can be either a solid line or a broken line, which means a line with a hole in the middle. So either a line that's completely solid or a line with a hole in the middle. And then each of the 8 symbols is 3 lines, and the lines can be solid, 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 or solid, broken, solid, or broken, broken, solid, etc. creating 8 possible combinations. Now, one of the 8 symbols in the Bagua is called kun, and kun is the symbol where you have 3 broken lines. So broken line, top broken line, top broken line. So it's basically like 3 lines that have a hole in the middle. It looks almost like 3 ice bricks that were broken in some fancy karate demonstration in the middle. And these 3 broken lines, 3 of them are broken, so all 3 lines are yin, all 3 are more feminine. And this trigram, this symbol kun of 3 consecutive broken lines, represents the most yin type of approach to movement or thinking or change. And when I think about Aikido and I look at the movement of Aikido, I think it's almost like a type of, if metaphorically speaking, of course, not technically or historically, almost like a Bagua Zhang that tries to specifically stress more of this kun aspect, the tall yin aspect of movement and thinking and flow. And by this, I mean, technically speaking, if you can try to imagine this, that in Aikido, one attempts to accept the opponent. So kun is total acceptance. It's like a mother who's willing to accept her, like be accepting of her husband, of her children, of the circumstances. And by this great acceptance, she has great power because nothing can go through her because she lets things by her and through. She doesn't get stuck on things. She just accepts them inward. The ultimate feminine. So in Aikido, the movement, oftentimes, not always, is about allowing the opponent's energy to manifest itself to the utmost, basically the total yin accepting the total yang, until it's at the point where it can be reversed and taken advantage of. So I'd like to ask Shifu Dennis, what does he think about that metaphor?
I think it's great. I love it. The different aspects of the trigrams and Bagua Zhang, I think some teachers claim that there's no kind of correlation in the actual practice, but from my, especially from Yang Shifu, he did talk about the different aspects and kind of principles and almost like a strategic perception of how to understand or utilize these principles of the trigrams from a martial art perspective. And like the kun, this yin perspective of absorbing and kind of swallowing something up like an ocean in a way is the a lot of, in Chinese they say earth, the earth trigram. So it's like the earth kind of swallowing something up like quicksand in a way or something. Mm-hmm. And then you have these other 8 extrapolations of this yin and yang in sets of 3, like this first kind of binary language that forms the foundation of the I Ching is, the opposite end is yang, like greater yang, like usually they call it like heaven trigram. And you still have, and you have this kind of expression on all these different variations in Bagua Zhang. And then, to draw the parallel with Aikido, I think it's almost like a simplified version of this in a way, because there are some movements in Aikido, for example, that have this very direct entering, forceful movement. Like in Aikido, they say irimi means entering. So it's this direct moving force. Something moves in and you kind of pivot in and through it and disrupt through the center. And then, but you have these other aspects in Aikido where you're receiving the movement of something of an opponent and just kind of swallowing them in and kind of folding them in and on top of themselves. So analogy that you made is a really good one, and I think it's interesting because I feel like Bagua Zhang and Aikido both kind of refer to utilize these principles, but Aikido is almost like a very simplified version. From simplified, not technically, but I mean simplified and conceptually.
Yeah, in terms of fear, we're not talking about the Aikido being a lesser martial art. They're not,
no,
not that at all. In just simplified in terms of theory and relating to Chinese philosophy.
Right, exactly. Almost like a Zen perspective of taking the I Ching, and instead of getting really complicated into all these almost like mathematical theorems and understanding how they all interrelate with each other, it's this kind of Zen moment of like, it's direct and entering, or it's soft turning and receiving, and it's like just simplifying it to that that extremity.
I think that Moye Ueshiba Sensei, although he wasn't a Zen Buddhist, his instructional method was very much a Zen Buddhist one, in that he really constructed his art, even though it has a curriculum, it's more so it is experiential. It is meant to be understood through the actual movement practice. Even though some Aikido teachers, they don't like to have too much discussion during class. After class, they might sit with students and explain a lot of things in great detail. But during class, it's meant for you to be able to absorb the message with a language that's a physical language, that's beyond words, almost in the same sense that you use in Zen Buddhism, understanding something not for words and theory, but for the experience.
Yeah, pure experience. Yeah, definitely. And I know that O-sensei was also very heavily influenced by Shinto thought, and there was a movement. I mean, the whole reason he was in Japan was to follow his spiritual teacher, Onisaburo, I think that was his name, and through China as a bodyguard. And that's how they ended up getting in trouble in the first place. But I think his name was something like Daiguchi Onisaburo, and he was a controversial figure that kind of created this this almost like a new religion that absorbed aspects of Shinto, the Japanese religion, and Zen Buddhism and other religions in this very spiritual kind of practice that, I mean, some Japanese considered it a cult, but O-sensei was very much involved in. And a lot of the aspects of his training were hinged on a lot of these spiritual perspectives. And, as for how much that may have opened them up to maybe learn, maybe O-sensei learned and practiced with some Bagua master in Manchuria at some point. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. It's hard to really tell, but my own perspective is that the older Aikido Jujutsu already had the root of whatever the foundation that is behind Bagua Zhang is there. And maybe the root of Bagua Zhang before it was even coalesced into something that was based on the Trigrams. It's kind of difficult to find out. Like one of the books that I had read, it suggested that the martial art of Bagua Zhang is actually much older, and that that Deng Haichuan had learned this from him, this Taoist priest, and that Deng Haichuan just took an expression of this and was given permission to teach it publicly. One of the popular theories is that Deng Haichuan trained a lot of different martial arts, and that he was a master in his own right, and that Bagua Zhang was just his own expression of all the martial arts that he studied before. But looking at all of the different martial arts that he had studied before, you can definitely see the influences of those traditional Chinese arts in what he trained. But I feel like there's a missing piece, there's a missing link. Like, it's very difficult for me to just explain it away as just claiming, oh, Deng Haichuan was a liar and he was making up this story about a Taoist priest to validate what he was teaching. I think that's very short-sighted, and I think misrepresents what potentially he actually really learned and then taught. I don't think he just magically invented Bagua on his own. I think that there is some kind of a root to what he trained, aside from the other martial arts that he, like Lohan and other martial arts. And I don't think he just kind of created Bagua completely on his own. My perspective on Bagua Zhang is basically that the way that Deng Haichuan taught it, the reason that there's so many different branches and expressions of the system and why some of them look so radically different from each other is that Bagua Zhang is an art that's based on taking someone's root and foundation in whatever martial art they learned before, and then using it as a method to improve their own skill and development to create a more well-rounded structure. So almost in a way, kind of like a deeper version of like what Bruce Lee was talking about with Jeet Kune Do, like finding your own way in a way, like taking someone else's root in everything they trained before, and then finding their own kind of expression. Like, you know, they say that Deng Haichuan took Bagua Zhang and he taught everyone like single change palm, double change palm, and maybe flowing palm, and everything else is just an extrapolation or a deepening concept of each one of those students' own version of those basic techniques, and everything else disseminated from that. And if you look at Bagua Zhang from that kind of root, and then you see all of the different systems that have come out of it, to me, that kind of makes more sense. That, you know, and also why it's difficult to compare different schools of Bagua Zhang, because you can see a common root in the way that they move and they use the system, but they're sometimes radically different from each other. Sometimes they'll have the same name for a different kind of a technique, or they'll have a different name for the same kind of a technique, and their expression of the art is radically different from each other. It's like it's how to create your own personal style from this system of Bagua Zhang, like this structural core system of Bagua. And I also, you know, that's why I think there's such a great diversity with the many Bagua Zhang, even within a lineage. Even if, you know, my own background in Cheng Bagua, if you look at the different branches of Cheng style Bagua Zhang, there's so many, and they all have very different flavors. And I think it's because each student is basically, they come into Bagua Zhang with their own foundation and some other kind of martial art before, and then each teacher teaches this kind of expression of principles that Bagua is based on, and then you have this kind of flowering of all of these myriad kind of mutated systems. And so that's why variety.
I think it's worth commenting here about that the nature of Chinese traditional instruction, which is confusing, could be very traditional and very liberal. So traditional in the sense that they tend to teach very slowly, and they tend to keep secrets. Not everybody gets everything that the teacher knows. And oftentimes they can even be nasty about it in a manner that we in the West we would consider nasty, in that they could teach someone, and that someone can think that, oh, you know, that was everything that there was to be taught, but there's 50% more, but they wouldn't get told. And on the so these are very traditional aspects. And on the other hand, there are also very liberal aspects. So for instance, the fact that most teachers wouldn't mind if a student just went and taught, even sometimes without asking. They'd be like, yeah, you know, I wouldn't teach that guy anymore because he didn't ask me for permission, but he can go about and teach whatever. And that sort of attitude sometimes can be disastrous because, you know, it could be somebody who was with them for 20 years and maybe that person is able and knowledgeable and skilled enough to do so. But oftentimes it's just someone who only practiced for a year or two and they shouldn't be teaching, but the teacher's like, yeah, you know, whatever, because they're very liberal about that sort of flowering that Shifu Dennis was just describing. They say, you know, it's gonna flower some way or another. It's gonna be a nice flower, an ugly flower. I don't care. It's not my problem. Just let it be. And I mean, the end result of this is that, okay, a teacher has got, say, 50 students over his lifetime, and say 10 of them go about and teach, and of the 10, maybe only 2 are actually qualified. So you got 8 that weren't, of different degrees of skill and understanding, and then they teach 50 people each, and they teach 50 people, and then you get these numerous branches and substyles of an art, and some of them are most excellent, and some of them are just complete trash, and there's everything in between, and it's so very difficult to tell, you know, okay, is this like, oh, they've got this thing, this is good, but why are they doing this way? It's like, then there's so much confusion, all due to the original sin of the teacher not really caring what the people are going to do with it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I see that a lot in many systems, and I think also I think it happened in Bagua too. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back a little bit on the topic of the 8 trigrams, that literally the Bagua, because I think a lot of people are confused with those symbols and the names, because people see, okay, there's, well, what is this? There's a symbol here called a marsh, or it's sometimes called a lake, and that thing is heaven, that thing is earth, that thing is thunder. What the hell does this have to do with, you know, traditional martial art? Shifu Dennis, could you please elucidate this for some of the listeners?
You know, it's interesting because it's a great question, and it's in some ways it's a controversial question in Bagua, and it's it's interesting because you have so many different teachers that kind of argue about the validity or the use and function of the trigrams in Bagua Zhang. And so I'll just go with my own experience with my own teachers. My first teacher, Sifu Starr, really downplayed the importance of the trigrams in the way that he taught Bagua. But my main teacher, Yang Shifu, he did explain the use of the trigrams from kind of from a perspective of different approaches, different principles, like
you used the word strategy earlier, right?
Yeah, like different strategies and principles, but also kind of like a different feeling. Like my perspective in looking at the different trigrams and even the different mother palms, for example. So, okay, so the basic outline and the basic structure of the system of Bagua Zhang. So the way that Yang Shifu would teach it, you would learn what he called the Xiaoba Zhang, which means the little 8 palms. And sometimes he would call it the Neba Zhang, and this means internal 8 palms. And then later on, after you learn this foundation, he would move on to teach the Bamu Zhang, the 8 mother palms, which are a little bit more complex.
Okay, so maybe we can just break this down for a second. So there's the main practice in Bagua Zhang of walking and moving between postures and techniques on a circle.
Right.
And while walking on that circle, you can hold fixed postures.
Right, exactly.
And when you're talking about the small 8 palms and the 8 mother palms, which follow them, you're not talking about fixed postures, but rather combinations of methods walked on the circle, right?
Exactly. So the little 8 palms is a way of training while doing the circle walking, where you're holding your body, your arms, in different postures, similar in many aspects to the way that people will hold different postures in standing, like Zhuanzhang, the standing practice, but you're doing so while moving and walking. And each one of these postures develops a certain level of strength. I've seen some kind of Bagua teachers, I cringe when I see this, that they treat these little 8 palms as almost being like these on guard postures that you use for fighting. But what they are really designed for is how to develop a certain kind of applied strength and body connection. So it develops structure in the body. Each one of the little palms, when you're actually moving and walking, when you're doing the circle walking, the stepping method is called wading through mud. So the principle is that you're creating a kind of compression in your body, where you are using the dynamics of the hand postures that you're holding to increase your whole body connection, to create a sense of connection and compression in the body, so it feels like you're getting deeper and deeper into the ground, getting more connected with your body and the environment as you walk. So
would it be fair to call it 8 different types of coiled springs?
Exactly, precisely, exactly. And then the Neiba Zhang are similar, but when you change the directions on walking the circles between the palms, the Neiba Zhang would be a little bit more complicated in that you're introducing more movement and technique. So it's a more complicated ways of moving in the direction change. And that's where you have the kind of forms, the martial arts forms in Bagua, where the techniques, the self-defense techniques are coded into the movements in the direction change.
Wait a second here. So
right.
Earlier you introduced them as synonyms, but actually there's the Xiaobajang, which are the 8 small palms. That's the 8 fixed postures held while walking the circle. And the Neibajang are actually the slightly more technically advanced versions of these, right?
Right. Kind of like an intermediate version where you're learning, where you're basically holding the same postures as you walk, but when you do the direction changes, there's more kind of technique and feeling that's explained when you're moving and changing the direction.
And the feeling becomes kind of, and the feeling is manifested with a certain type of imagery, right?
Yeah, definitely. You use your imagination and your intent, and this is where you learn more kind of principles and techniques of self-defense that apply to the different principles of movement behind the different postures, and that becomes the foundation for later moving on to the 8 mother palms.
Okay, before we discuss the 8 mother palms, let me ask you 2 questions here. So first of all, for how long is one expected to hold a single posture in practice?
In the beginning, Yangshu would say ideally you want to move at least 100 steps in each direction before you go the other direction. Mm-hmm. Then, and then he would basically say, if you don't have enough time, because if you go through all 8 postures, 100 steps, that's over an hour or 2 just walking the circle. And not everyone has that kind of time. So he says, maybe do 20 steps each direction if you're really constrained with the time. Mm-hmm. But what's important is the development of the sense of feeling and understanding the principle behind the movement and the kind of connection and structure that you're developing in your body, so that the fascia, the connective tissue, the energy kind of flows through the body, and it develops a continuously deepening root while you're moving. So Bagua, you're developing a a mobile root as you're walking. So it's similar to other martial arts like Xingyi and Taiji, for example, but instead of staying stationary and absorbing an attack and developing force while standing in a very solid posture, the emphasis is on creating a solid structure while being mobile. And then the more complicated palm changes in the intermediate palms, you're learning more complex ideas and feelings about how to move in relation to an attack and different techniques specifically. So those are kind of the forms. And then later on in the mother palms, that becomes a foundation to understand those principles and techniques more. And they all kind of interplay with each other. When you get into a mother palm.
So just a moment before we get to mother palms, I have the second question. Could you kindly give us an example or two for the type of imagery one would use when training the so-called stationary, not stationary, but fixed palms?
Right. So for the first one that we start off with in our branch of Cheng Bagua is it's called Xia Zhang. Xia meaning like downward, crushing palm. Mm-hmm. And the principle here is to develop this kind of crushing power in the body, but what you're doing is triangulating your posture and your whole body structure so that you're able to feel the ground essentially and get very comfortable with moving in this, with the tangnibu, with the wading through mud, so that you feel more connected to the ground. So it's kind of like you're feeling the ground through your hands. With the Xiatajang, your hands are pressing downward at a slightly forward angle, maybe 20, 30 degrees in front of you, and the palms are open and spread. I've seen some schools of Bagua Zhang that they will hold the spine kind of upward, erect, but Yang Shifu would emphasize a principle of movement and structure in the body called Chuyo Zhengshou, means pry the waist, grow the arms. So the more that your hands are extending, the more you're tucking your hips under and prying the waist and pressing out back through the kidneys and the tucking your hips and sacrum and coccyx under, pressing the kidney back and creating this kind of spinal structure, or you would say tongbei, like through the back, or a xiangbei, which is bear's back. So there's a slight tilt that allows you to, the upper body slightly tilts forward so it drops your center of gravity into the ground, but your tailbone tucks under and pushes forward. So you create this vector of force moving forward from up underneath as you move, so that the body has this feeling of connection and rootedness. So if someone's trying to push on you from any kind of direction, it feels like you're sunk into the ground. And with a downward crushing palm, your hands are kind of extended out and feeling and reaching into the ground to accentuate that feeling of connectedness with the ground and feeling. And so it creates this kind of triangulated or pyramid kind of a vector where you're getting into your legs, dropping the center of gravity into the ground as you move to create this very powerful kind of feeling for stepping. So every time you're stepping, you're trying to develop this deepening root with every step, where you're feeling the ground deeper and deeper, like your feet are getting stuck in mud, but at the same time you're driving through it, wedging through it. And that's creating this connection with your whole body by creating this compression with the legs, with your center, your core sinking into the ground, but also that your hips are prying downward, but the top of your head is lifting up. So you're creating this prying feeling through the whole spine. So your body has this whole body connection. And other systems of Bagua I've seen, they will hold the spine a little bit more upright and erect so that the spine kind of hangs downward. But the emphasis with the Bagua that we learn from Yang Shifu is that you're moving in and through an opponent. And if your hips are, if you feel like your spine directly suspended over and you're driving through someone to take their balance, you're going to get knocked over. You're going to knock yourself over if you're meeting with resistive force. So what you're essentially doing is it's a way to add compression into your posture so that you can move and uproot someone as you're stepping through their base at a vector or an angle.
So for those listeners who are not used to that kind of language, it might sound like an interesting fairy tale. However, it's not until you actually hold a specific posture, even without walking, and try to implement every single one of those imageries inside of your body whilst you're holding the posture. And then as you're walking, that you realize how difficult it is to do 50 things at one time and maintain that sort of sensation. And this is essentially the most basic posture in Shifu Dennis's Cheng style Bagua Zhang. So this is what everything he described right now, as complex as it is, just beginner's practice to show one how deep the art really is. And, you know, so for some people, it might sound kind of strange. And why is he giving all of this, you know, fancy narrative about you feel this, you feel that? But these types of imageries, or we call them yi in Chinese internal martial arts, the right intention. These are actually some of the most profound secrets that those arts have, but they do not manifest themselves unless you've tried to put those sensations into practice with every single movement for a certain number of years.
Right. And it's interesting because when you first introduce a student to stepping and moving this way, you know, they think, oh, it doesn't look very difficult. It looks kind of weird, but whatever. And then when you start showing them actually what they're trying to do and how it's supposed to feel, and you start correcting their posture, they find out really quick how challenging it really is. And what looks like an easy exercise, they're breaking a heavy sweat after just 5 minutes of doing it, you know. So so it's challenging, but what's one of the things that's really interesting about Bagua Zhang is the dynamic of the difficulty of the training, but at the same time, everyone that I've talked to, you know, myself included, when I started training Bagua, it has a very different feeling in your body when you're training. Like, even if you do really intensive Bagua practice, it has a way of making you feel tired when you're done, but also invigorated at the end. Like your body feels very connected, and you feel like you've been supercharged, like you just got plugged in and your batteries are all charged. But even though your limbs might feel tired and weak, like you need to rest, but your whole body feels really connected, because it helps to lubricate the joints and the fascia. All the structure in your body is really supported when you're doing it correctly. And it is difficult to kind of understand what we're talking about here without seeing it, and even more to feel it. Have an instructor put their hands on you and add some resistance so that you know what you're actually cultivating to develop the structure and the power that what we're talking about. And without really seeing and feeling it can be really difficult, I'm sure, to understand all the details.
I think that biochemically, you are draining yourself as one would with any type of rigorous exercise. So for instance, you use up the glycogen storage in your muscles, but energetically, you're also opening up your internal organs and channels so that the body is now moving and generating energy and moving about energy and also blood much more efficiently as compared with before you had the practice. And this is why one could feel like, oh, you know, in some ways I am drained, but in other ways now the body is actually more efficient. So there is a sense of well-being.
Yeah, more nourished is a way.
Yes. I think, though, I asked you something earlier and you gave me a partial answer, but maybe not quite what the listeners are looking for when I was speaking about the Bagua, the 8 trigrams, and talking about, oh, there's thunder and there is lake and there is mountain and there's heaven and there's earth. What do those words mean in actual movement practice? And maybe you can connect this to the mother palms as well.
Okay, so in training with Yang Shifu, like you can kind of interpret the different trigrams as being kind of abstractly related to the mother palms or any of the palms, even the little 8 palms. But the way that Yang Shifu would explain the way that the trigrams relate to Bagua as a martial art, it was more a kind of different perspective or each one had its own kind of feeling or strategy for dealing with different situations or different kinds of attacks or situations or adversity in general, whether it's or like an emotional, like an argument with someone.
So let's give some concrete examples by drawing, on 2 extremes. If we have the heaven and earth, what are these 2 strategies? How do you apply these?
Yeah, so heaven, the idea of the Qian trigram, the heaven shape, the ultimate yang, the concept is to kind of overwhelm and in any kind of aggressive force and like kind of how do I explain it? Like stopping it with, I'm sorry?
Roll over it.
Yeah, kind of, or stealing the initiative and obliterating it, like at the instant that someone is trying to attack you, instead of like waiting for them to move, you kind of steal the initiative. You take the intent and obliterating that at the instant, like when they start to think about moving to attack. It's this this instant immobilization of an attack. Like for example, the moment that someone, like if they're about to hit you, it's like you see their eyes flash, and even the moment before they raise their fist to punch you, it's like you feel the intention and you blow through that attack. You take their initiative and overwhelm them before they can even launch the attack. And
I think the beauty of it is not that we can take those Bagua strategies and principles and apply them for the classification of any technique or anything we see. We can take an MMA match and see which movement and technique relates more to each of the Bagua, each of the trigrams. So I would say oftentimes a double leg takedown is a type of Qian technique, a heaven technique, right?
Yeah, I would actually say that you can apply any technique with any of these strategies. It's all about the timing and the intention behind them. It's all about distance and timing and how you are shaping your response to the aggression or the attack. Even to the point where you can use the different strategies behind the trigrams, even in personal conversation or arguments. Like if you feel like you're being attacked verbally, you can apply the same principles and the same strategies even in a verbal context. It doesn't have to be a physical confrontation, but learning it from a standpoint of physical self-defense is the best way to really get tangible feeling for what it is that you're using it for, how it feels. And earth, for example, would be just the opposite. So the kun trigram that you referenced before, and you talked about receiving. So the main feeling here at the very opposite end of the spectrum is someone's attacking, and you are essentially drawing their movement in. And like maybe an example is if someone's shoving you, maybe you would like grab the wrists and yank and pull in and down, or pull and turn and duck and throw them over your shoulder, or just basically like take, so in Taiji, you have like the four inners, Peng Wu Ji An, like drawing in, pulling in and down. That would be kind of an expression there of Gun, is someone's shoving you, you take their arms and pull them in and down and kind of sweep the floor with their face. So that's kind of a very simple kind of expression, but a very basic one about the differences between the trigrams. And then you have all of these different variations that get into different kinds of angular movement and different kinds of timing and expression and different kinds of footwork and different kinds of body feeling that are related with each one. It can get, I mean, you know, going through just these cycles alone with the students, it can take really kind of months to go over each one of these strategies, because each one of these strategies is almost like it's almost like a style or a system in it of itself in dealing with an attack. And that's why like each one of the palms and the little palms, or the internal 8 palms, or the 8 mother palms, you know, you can kind of interpret a different trigram, a different gua to each one of those, but it doesn't, you can also apply each one of those trigrams in a different way to each mother palm, because the mother palms in themselves are, you can interpret the trigrams with them, but the mother palms themselves are almost like a different subsystem within Bagua. Like when you get into the mother palms, they all have their foundational principle behind each one of the mother palms, and it's a different concept. It's a different feeling. Like the foundation in the mother palms is the single change palm. And a lot of people, when they learn the different mother palms, they misinterpret the meanings of the mother palms as being single change palm is 1, double change palm is 2, flowing palm is 3, and they just think of it as sequential. But it's not. That's not really what the mother palms are. You can interpret it this way, but you're just learning the outer frame of the form and not really understanding the deeper meaning of the system. And the mother palms themselves each teach their own unique principles behind each one. So for example, the single change palm, the principle is singularity of movement. Everything moving like one, like your whole body becomes the one hand. Everything moving from one point, from lower dantian, as one singularity. And then contrast that with shuang, so dan huanzhang, single changing palm, that's the root principle. The second one, the double change palm, shuang huanzhang, everything is moving as a pair, a duality, opposite but complementary force. Everything moving together, but as a separate pair. So you have this dynamic of duality that interpolates with all of the movements and techniques. Then you get into shun zhang, which is flowing palm. And the principle there, shun is the same character and meaning as ju in jiu-jitsu or judo. It just means to go with the flow. It doesn't mean soft, it means to go with the flow. And so that's the first 3 of the mother palms, and each one of them successively after that has its own basic principle. Each one of them are almost like a different subsystem within Bagua Zhang to understand all of these different principles and strategies that you can essentially just take each one of the mother palms and train it to understand it almost like a different subsystem all on its own.
So here I think it's important that we clarify to listeners the difference between techniques and concepts. And I want to exemplify this through Chinese philosophy, specifically in comparing the 5 phases, or some people call the 5 phases the 5 elements, and the Bagua, the 8 trigrams. Yeah. So if we look at the 5 phases, each of them represents a color, a season, a situation, an organ. They represent a thing, and it's a conceptual system, yeah, because the season is not exactly one thing, it's a dynamic of things, but it's still, whether it's one thing or many things, it's still an amalgamation of physical phenomena.
A phase, right.
Yeah, so for example, you have the metal phase, the water phase, the wood phase, the fire phase, the earth phase. And the corresponding colors, you have white or whitish gray, and which is metal. You have blue or dark blue or black for water, and you have green or greenish for wood, and you have red for fire, or reddish, and you have brownish, off brown and yellowish for earth. So these are very specific colors or color ranges, or seasons. Could be spring, summer, late summer, autumn, and winter. That is compared with these would be the 5 phases, 5 elements. When we talk about the Bagua, what we're talking about are qualities of change.
Exactly.
So for example, what is meant by that is, I'll try to bring up examples. For instance, if you have 2 people shaking hands, so the Gua, one of the trigrams, doesn't describe the one hand, the shape or quality of one hand. It doesn't describe the other hand. It doesn't even describe the shape of the 2 hands coming together. It describes the feeling and the energetic transference between the hands as they shake.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's really good.
Yeah. So I just made it up. So it really describes the in-between things.
Yeah.
Which is what is so very difficult to understand, because you can often not describe the quality of the in-between. Like it doesn't describe, for instance, you're eating something. It doesn't describe the cake. It doesn't describe your mouth. It describes the interchange of what happens in your mouth as you put the cake in.
Yeah.
and that sort of interplay, that sort of feeling that's very hard to describe, because there's so many tastes and textures and things moving from side to side, up and down and left and right, and it was solid and now it's liquid. It's a whole show. It's a whole interplay of things, and this interplay is that one thing that we are going to try and put a symbol on, and this would be one of those 8 symbols, one of those 8 trigrams.
Right, exactly. It's an expression, a symbol for a phase of change or transformation. Exactly.
Yeah, so when Shifu Dennis describes those mother palms, and he talks about, it's a quality of change. This is what he's talking about. It's the feeling when your body touches the opponent's body in a certain way. And it doesn't matter if it's your leg that is touching, or your palm, or maybe even your head. It's the quality of that connection that you're trying to explore, which is why it's such an advanced martial art, because it goes beyond concept. You could say, some people say Bagua Zhang is a martial art of concepts, but actually you could say Taijiquan and Xingyiquan are arts of concepts, because they're talking about physical concepts. Here it's energetic interplay. It's something, it's like there's physics, the the five phases, five elements, and such. That's the physics, and then the Bagua is the metaphysics.
Yeah, yeah, that's an excellent way to put it. Like, you hear a lot of people refer to Bagua Zhang as being like graduate level martial arts because you get your foundation and one thing or another, and then Bagua becomes like how you round everything out and really understand it on a whole other level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you mentioned several times young Shifu. Shifu Dennis is referring to his teacher, Yang Guotai.
Yes.
And we haven't gotten to how you guys met and how was he like as a teacher, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. I was really incredibly lucky and blessed to have met him in the circumstances that I did, really. I had moved to Seattle in 1999, and I had surveyed the martial arts scene, and I really wanted to continue learning up here. And I met several of the local instructors, and some of them didn't quite have like the depth of training that I was looking for. And so I went to Vancouver, which is about 2.5-ish, 2-3 hour drive north of Seattle. And I was hoping to meet some of the more famous Bagua instructors that lived around Vancouver. And I came up during this big international Tiger Bomb tournament. And I was, towards the third day, because it was like a weekend long tournament, I was feeling kind of discouraged because I hadn't found this instructor that I was hoping to meet. He didn't actually come to the tournament. And so it was like on the Sunday, and I was watching this push hands competition, just checking everything out and what's going on. And I see a guy practicing in the corner, not in competition. He's just practicing off kind of behind the chairs and the bleachers, and he's doing some Bagua, and it was really impressive. And I introduced myself, and his name was John Spack, and he, I asked where he's training, and he said, well, my instructor's over there officiating in the push hands competition. And so after the competition finished, John introduced me and talked to Yang Shifu for a little bit. And Yang was like, he said, oh, so you like Bagua, yeah? So I said, yeah, I love it. And he said, okay, you show me your Bagua. And so I start to go through some of the Zhang style Bagua that I had learned before from Sifu Starr, and I was trying to be really precise because I figured this guy was really good, and trying to make a good impression. And so after seeing a couple of the palm changes, he's not really paying any attention anymore. And he's kind of talking with John on the side and a couple other people, and he finally makes me stop and waves me over, and he asked me, oh, so that one Bagua? He asked me, and I said, yeah, it's Zhang style Bagua. And he said, no, that no Bagua. He says, you want to learn real Bagua? And then he starts to demonstrate really brief but amazing kind of movements from his Cheng Bagua, and it just totally blew my mind. And I was like, yeah, definitely. So 2 days later, I made arrangements with work and came back up, took the drive up to Vancouver again, brought an offering basket of fruit and gifts to, the traditional way. And that was it. That was in it was in 2000, early 2000. I was totally hooked, and I would go up to Vancouver. I would make the trip like every other weekend and on holidays and any kind of extra time I could get off work. And spend like whole weekend and like at least 2 times a month for 3-4 days and all weekend and train with Yang Shifu and his students. And I did that for several years and loved every minute of it. And I couldn't consider myself to be more blessed than to have met and trained with him. It totally changed my whole perspective on Bagua Zhang in general and life overall. It was pretty amazing.
So. Well, I would say he baited you quite well.
Oh, he did. He totally like hook, line, and sinker. I practically swallowed the whole fishing rod. So I was totally in. Yeah.
As you were demonstrating, he probably turned his gaze intentionally.
Maybe.
You know, I would like to say, I'm not so going to say something negative. It's just going to sound a little bit negative in the beginning. I do believe there is such a thing as reverse racism, because we did start this talk discussing, you know, the negative side of racism. Reverse racism, I would give a funny example. So I'm Jewish Israeli, and when I came to China, as I was told this was going to happen, I found out most Chinese people really love Jews, and the story behind this is incredible. So there is a very famous book, anti-Semitic book, called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this, have you heard of it?
I've heard of it, but I never read it.
It's a book that basically, I think it's from the end of the 19th century, written in Russia. And it's about a meeting of the so-called top world Jewry, which already is ridiculous because people think the Jews have ranking, like you get a black belt being a Jew, you know? Because, you know, the other day I was listening to a lecture to an interview, and the interviewee was saying, like, I'm a high-ranking feng shui consultant, and like you ain't got black belts in feng shui. That's not how that works. But in any case, in that book, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it's like about these top Jews having a meeting, and in the meeting they're talking about running the world, because obviously the Jews control and run the world. Now in Europe, I mean, this book became widespread, and it was used to breed a lot of very negative anti-Semitism. However,
including Nazism. Correct?
Yeah. The Nazis used it. Yeah, but it was way before. I mean, it's the end of the 19th century, so it's much older than the Nazi movement. And when that book got to China and Japan, when they translated it, the cultural context was lost in translation, because there were hardly any Jews in China or Japan, just, you know, maybe less than a few thousand people. So they don't know what a Jew is. They really don't know what a Jew is. And then they got this book that says there's this World Jewish Convention, but like a bunch of them get, and they control the world. And their thinking's like, wow, those Jews must be so smart. That's incredible. Look what they're doing. They're so good at business. Like we gotta be like them. We gotta rule the world like that. So in a strange twist, it turned out that this book created a giant wave of reverse racism with Jewish people that lasts to this day all over China and Japan. Less so in Japan nowadays, because they also got the more proper anti-Semitism, unfortunately, over the years. But in China, if you're Jewish and you tell people you're Jewish and you're from Israel, then commonly people would start they take their finger and they screw the finger into their head, which in Chinese culture it means smart rather than insane, and they're like, oh, yotai, smart, and people would literally come to you and give you their business cards and want to do business with you because you're Jewish, and it's so absurd. It's so that this is positive reverse racism, right? Yeah. And in North America, oftentimes we have the reverse racism with Chinese masters and Japanese masters, where they come and the people are like, oh, he's Asian and he knows martial arts, he must have mystical powers, and
Right.
and seldom it gets to dark places, with taking advantage of people sexually, and could be all sorts of things. Usually
Right.
it's just the level of these silly things in everyday life. And I was thinking, as you were telling this story about your Shifu, an American, someone born in the United States, it's obviously born in the United States,
Yeah.
might not get such a positive treatment, trashing another person's teachings. Like, if say you're Shifu Dennis, like you're an American teacher and you'd be at a convention, you'd say, oh, that teacher's martial art, that's just crap. And people might raise a few eyebrows, but
Yeah.
is this Chinese man? So obviously knows what he's talking about, right? Because it's reverse racism.
Yeah, because he's Chinese, right? He must know.
Yeah, but we like you said, like we Westerners, we tend to buy into that. It works.
Yeah. Yeah, that was yeah, a lot of people do that. I know there's some of my classmates, when I was training with the Yangshu, they had talked about their, I don't remember the Taiji instructor's name, but apparently he would welcome his new students like at this opening like ceremony, and he literally like pissed on them from his balcony and gave them a golden shower. And apparently this was supposed to bless his new students. And I was like no way. And apparently it's a thing. And
It's a wait. Because you said pissed on them, and I was like, yeah, he mistreated. No, you meant it literally.
he literally pissed on them from the balcony. And and like, why would you guys follow this guy? And and yeah, he apparently he's pretty well known in Taiji circles. But yeah, there's definitely an issue with some of the Chinese instructors that will not really teach someone the quote unquote real art unless they are Chinese. And even Chinese instructors, they won't even teach you unless you're from a specific Han majority. And if you're
the
a
opposite
minority,
could be in certain Chinese, Southern Chinese martial arts.
Yep.
But the example I know, I don't want to name names, though I could. But
Yep.
if you're not of the Hakka minority,
Yep.
then you're not gonna get. I mean, you might get taught well, but not the entire curriculum.
Right. And it's pervasive. And when I was getting into Chinese martial arts, and then when I came up here into Seattle, I was naive enough to think that all of those things were, history, that, it happened to Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee changed all of these things because he told all these people, and then everyone saw through the bullshit of the racism. But I was I was in for a rude awakening, because I had met some of these people that wouldn't teach based on their genealogical lineage or their heritage or their religion. Like even in Indonesia, there are pencak silat instructors that won't teach you unless you are full-blooded Indonesian and for example Muslim or something else, and they just won't teach you at all. You can't even get in to see the class. And so the racism is a thing that it's there's a lot of white supremacists, but there's also a lot of racism that happens in a lot of different cultures as well.
And the question, I mean, we gotta ask, is it racism or is it tribalism? And they're not exactly the same. And the example I want to give is, I mean, these are often traditions that had outlived their use, because I mean, 200 years ago in East Asia, where people were still doing a lot of fighting with very basic weaponry or empty-handed, You wouldn't teach members of the other tribe or the other ethnicity or race because this was your tribe's secret technology.
Yeah, your family, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, it made sense. So, I mean, that they keep such a tradition in that manner. Is it really because, I mean, in North America, we have the complicated history with races and ethnicities. That's not exactly always the same history that we have in East Asia, not always. And maybe it's not that, you know, they don't like or they despise or they look down another race. It's just that they're trying to preserve a tradition that, you know, no, it's just no longer relevant and they're just stubborn about
it. Yeah. All totally valid and excellent points. I agree. And it's just kind of surprising when you encounter it because, you know, my experience is that I thought all that stuff was, you know, people didn't really think that way. And then when I actually encountered it in person, I was just kind of surprised. It's like, wow, you know, to be that kind of protective on one hand and then demeaning to other people in another sense that, you know, I can understand it from certain contexts, but in today's day and age, it seems, you know, maybe I'm being a little bit, a little bit presumptive, but to me, it seems really elitist and kind of sad. Yeah.
Yeah, it is elitist many a time. But you know what? Let me share with you some interesting experience that I had in China whilst I was living and studying there. Yeah. So the vast majority of Chinese people, when they would see a Westerner such as myself in the park practicing and studying, they'd be very positive about it. They'd be happy that someone is interested in their traditions and is trying to learn, etc., etc. But maybe 1 in 1,000 people who would walk by and see me, you know, maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, there'd be somebody that would come over and just talk nasty, you know, like you'd say, like who's that sucker? He's not one of ours. Like why is he practicing? Like why they would tell my Shugong, Master Joe, my teacher's teacher, like why do you teach him and stuff like that. And I remember this one time when this guy, a guy like that, got into a very bitter argument with Shugong Zhou, and I could I could speak basic Chinese at the time, just carry myself in basic conversation in daily life, but I could understand more than I could say. So you know, when you live for many months on end in a place, like you get the sounds, you get the words, so you get more vocabulary than you can express. And I could understand that this person was telling my teacher, you know, he's a foreigner. You shouldn't teach him, and he's stupid and he doesn't understand. And the funny thing was that, you know, I'm not stupid and I could understand what he was saying.
Right.
And my teacher was yelling at him, and he was gonna jump him. Like that, some friends of him had to interfere and just, you know, grab him. It was like, hold me. It's like he's gonna jump the guy. And I could see how protective he was, and I saw him on several occasions tell people, you know, if those Westerners are not going to study our arts, we might not be able to preserve those traditions.
Right.
And a lot of people there in the city of Tianjin and elsewhere that I've been, they had this conceptual understanding, and it transcended their original biases, or you could say for some of them racism. My own Shifu Nitzan, he told me when he got to Master Joe originally, that he got this cold treatment, that Joe Shifu, you know, having grown up during the Cultural Revolution and the time following that, and he absorbed all of that nasty propaganda that, you know, the United States is just full of villainous, malevolent people, and that all Westerners are only coming to China in order to subjugate the Chinese and take advantage of them financially, or who knows, even sexually. Maybe they're trying to take all the Chinese women, and there's all sorts of nasty propaganda. So much in the manner that we have seen in the United States for the past few years, there's a lot of, I'm not getting into politics here, Republican, Democrat, I don't care. It's just this thing with China virus, you know?
Right. Right.
As if
Right.
Chinese people, almost 1.5 billion people, are directly responsible for the existence of virus, which is just a terrible idea and a terrible, terrible thing to say. But you
Right.
know what? Imagine this propaganda going on for a few years, 10 times, 20 times, 50 times worse in China for several decades against Westerners. That's why what a lot of these people absorbed as they were
Right.
growing up. And then, you know, all these Westerners started coming in and China is opening up and they are sort of conflicted. You know, I've been hearing this all those decades, but here are all these Westerners. They're not as evil as they're said to be, most of them.
Yeah.
And they're trying, you know, it's very difficult for them to sort of settle within themselves the biases they had with the reality that they were observing. And indeed, Master Joe, after a few months, seeing that my Shifu was very hardworking and dedicated and was studying a language and could speak with him, he changed his attitude completely, 180 degrees. But it took a few months. It took a long while because prior to that, it's just, yeah, you know, he's a paying customer from abroad. I'm just going to give him a little, keep him around. I got to make a living. From that to eventually accepting him as his foremost disciple and acknowledging him as such before other people. This was a very immense transformation. And one sees, you know, with exposure to other people, other cultures, that they could change their mind. And it's the same in North America. We're worried about racism and all, but eventually, if people get enough exposure, things like that can be cured. It takes a lot of time, but it can be done.
Yeah, and similarly, one of the things that I remembered Yang Shifu talking about sometimes in class, and as an aside and related to what we're talking about, is he would talk about accepting a lot of different students, and whether we're Chinese or not. And because the question would come up sometimes, you know, some of my classmates would bring up some of their other instructors that would do some of these really horrendous things. Like I mentioned, the one that pissed on people and stuff. And Yang Shifu was like, his perspective was, there were a lot of Chinese people that they kind of, some of them take Chinese martial arts for granted, or kind of, some of them don't respect it. And part of that maybe is because of the revolution. And so Yang Shifu's own perspective is sometimes, you know, Chinese people aren't hungry. They don't really care to learn it. They don't see any value in it. And he says it's sad, but he says whatever it takes so that the treasure can survive, he'll take students that are hungry to learn and pass it on. And he didn't care what race or religion or color they were. And so I got really lucky because he wasn't one of these kind of racist instructors that would, you know, hide the real training. He as long as you're hungry and devoted, and what he always put an emphasis on, if someone's a good person, if they have a good character and morality and ethics, he would teach you. But there was an example, like, interestingly enough, I won't mention names, but the instructor that I was originally going to Vancouver to train with, that I didn't meet when I met Yang Shifu by happenstance. I found out a couple of years later, Yang Shifu got a phone call, and he took the phone call, and then he was very abrupt. And what I found out is the instructor that I had been going to Vancouver to try and learn from, this particular instructor had been courting Yang Shifu to try and learn his Bagua from him for years. And Yang Shifu told him no over and over again. And
why did he refuse without naming names?
Yeah. And in Yang Shifu's own words, he said, him, me no like, no good person. And he talked about part of the reason is because in China, he would help the Red Guard to round people up, and including other martial artists. And that was the way that this other instructor survived through the Cultural Revolution. And so Yang Shifu didn't like him or trust him.
I think I know whom you mean.
Yeah. And
but I should say, if someone recognizes, whom we're talking about without naming the name, I mean, it's a person who's is a very good martial artist and a very good teacher, irrespective of
right.
personality.
Yeah, true. And I just lucked out and in meeting Yang Shifu, because Yang Shifu was not a published author. He wasn't really well. The only way that you would know about him is through word of mouth, and I didn't know. I mean, I had been studying Bagua for about a decade from Sifu Starr before I met Yang Shifu, but my only sources of information were books and magazines, because there was no internet at that point. Internet was just starting, but not enough to be relevant enough to really find out who Bagua teachers really were. There
was Bagua Journal already back in the day, right?
Right, and that was it. There was the published books and the martial arts magazines and the Bagua Journal, and that was it. And Yang Shifu wasn't mentioned in any of them, but man, did I hit gold when I met him. It was it was old school training, and he was very generous the way he taught. Sometimes he was quite a character.
Tell us some stories.
Yeah, I mentioned this before in an article that I wrote, but a lot of times we would refer to him, we wouldn't call him Bagua Yoda, but a lot of times we would refer to him as the Bagua Yoda, because of his character, kind of eccentric. And he, kind of felt like going to Vancouver and training with him was like Luke going to Dagobah, finding this crazy old master out in the forest, and you think he's crazy, and then all of a sudden he does these amazing things that you can't hardly comprehend, and it's mind-blowing. I mean, some of the different things, just right off the bat, I mean, his depth and understanding and the way he could explain things, even though he had really broken English and I spoke almost no Chinese. Thankfully, we had translators. He was still very good at explaining different principles. He talked a lot about molar or fascia and development. And so he had a strong understanding of anatomy, and it wasn't just, hard to understand theory. Like, it was all practical concepts and how to develop the body from the inside out, but also practically for self-defense. Like, his skill was real.
That's quite unusual. My book, Research of Martial Arts, was perhaps the first martial arts book back in 2014 to thoroughly discuss the relationship between martial arts and fascia. This was hinted to and discussed a little bit in Tom Myers's seminal work, Anatomy Trains, which is a most excellent book, but not from, the pure martial arts perspective. So for you to say that, already in 2000, 2001, there was somebody who's talking and discussing fascia and its relationship to martial arts with students, that was pretty advanced at the time.
Right. So Yang Shifu, a little bit of background on Yang Shifu is he was the head Tuina practitioner at Beijing Hospital for some time. I don't know how long he was doing that, but he had a really deep understanding of connective tissue and body structure. And the way that he explained a lot of the practice and the style of Bagua that we practice, that it's Cheng Longxing Yoshen Bagua Zhang, which means dragon-shaped swimming body Bagua. And a lot of the practice from a physiological standpoint puts a lot of emphasis on developing the connective tissue and the fascia. as opposed to just kind of a brute strength. So moving from the inside was one of the things that really emphasized. Yeah, so he would emphasize a lot of the physiological anatomy and the development and the training, where he would use terms a lot in his training, like how to develop the connective tissue and the fascia. And he talked a lot about moving from the inside, and he liked to use this expression of cellular movement. And
What do you mean
he
by
meant
that? Cellular
yeah,
movement.
yeah. So what he would talk about is like each cell of the body being like its own unit, like its own entity, kind of like a big school of fish, like moving together in a waveform, like from the deep cells of your body moving from the inside, and the whole system in your body moving internally like a waveform, like in the way that like the fish will swim, like specifically like an eel or a shark or a carp, the way that their whole body will move together like one piece, but moving from the inside, or the way that an octopus, like a cephalopod, or a cat will move. You know, that when a cat prowls, it's like its arms and legs don't just like move independently. You can see this kind of wave move its whole body in this connected unit. It's very sensitive to everything around it. That's why its balance, its proprioception is so high, is because they're able to feel everything around them. And so he would talk about this moving from the inside, so you're feeling and listening from everything around you. And so you kind of create this feeling of like swimming in the body whenever you're moving. And that's what creates this cohesiveness and power in the body. You know, so as far as
do you did he equate the movement to actual, you know, various types of ocean creatures in that sense?
Yeah, right. Yeah, he would sometimes he would say the Chinese name and sometimes have to draw the picture of like an octopus or an eel or something like that, or like you'd talk about a shark or a carp, in the way that they move and swim, and the way that you use your core and your center as like a pivot point, but all the other limbs of the body having these other kind of dantians or pivot points, and everything moving together like a waveform, so that you have this whole body connected power moving. Shunfa, the body method, being this core principle in the way everything moved, and not just kind of moving from arms and legs separate from the body, but everything being this connective whole. And it was really incredible. Some of the things he would do, like when you would grab onto him, his body would kind of shift and ripple, like you were holding on to a snake, or like if you've ever actually handled an octopus, the way that the body will like move like a gel form. And it was surreal and really powerful. Like he could do this thing where if you grabbed around his throat and try to grab his trachea, he could kind of inflate his neck. And I'm not talking about just the platysma of the connective tissue around your neck and just kind of flaring out your neck. Like you literally couldn't, like the skin on the inside would flare outward. Or like if you try to hook his clavicle and like hang and pull down, it's a common kind of a balance point or pain point. If you hook someone's clavicle, he could literally kind of like inflate his body so that you couldn't actually hook the ridge of his clavicle. And I was like, what the hell? Like how? And he said, yeah, that one, good power, no forget. He's like, Bagua person, move from inside, and like all of this crazy stuff. And yeah, there's a lot of really amazing things that he would do, like similar to that. And just his body timing and the way that he taught and all of the kind of principles and strategies. It was all very practically focused training, but it was practical in a self-defense sense, but also even the way that he taught Qigong, he would reference a lot about how to actually engage the fascia and the tissue on the inside to activate and like, for example, when you're doing the circle walking and the tangnibu, an example is you engage your kidneys to help move your hip. So not like just thinking about your kidneys and using your imagination, but actually learning how to engage the fascia and the way it wraps around your kidney in a coil to actually engage the tissue, not just your psoas, to actually pull and lift your hips when you're doing the stepping. So like, it sounds like crazy and abstract, but when you put your hands on the old man and you feel things rippling on the inside, you understand that he's not just using a metaphor or an abstraction. He's literally talking about engaging the tissues and moving from the inside, from the organs. And it was mind-blowing, but it was also very powerful at the same time. And it just, when you learn that kind of movement and what he was talking about, you can see it or feel it in some instructors, and when they have it or when they don't. And the effect is pretty profound.
You know, one of the problems we commonly have in daily life, aside from martial arts, is that we have a lot of preconceived ideas that we have absorbed in childhood or young adulthood that we don't let go of, but oftentimes we heard those ideas from complete morons or happen to have read them, you know, in textbooks that befitted 8-year-olds. So one of those ideas is that there are a lot of these things inside our bodies that we cannot control, that we get told as children, like, oh, you can't control your heart rate, you cannot control your blood pressure, which is obviously total nonsense, right? Like everybody who's been to the military or even had any type of advanced shooting training knows that yes, you can actually control your heart rate and blood pressure. And these are relatively simpler things to gain a measure of control of. Not to mention that a lot of people biologically have more propensity for such control. Just a side example, in the Israeli Defense Forces, it is well known that Jewish Russians tend to be on average more suitable than others for sniper positions. The reason being that for whatever evolutionary reason that came to be, a lot of Russians have retained, I guess, a primal ability to control their heart rate.
Interesting.
And they have this naturally. So when they learn how to shoot, in the military, their commanders can pay attention to whom among the soldiers have this sort of skill innately, and they don't even need to get taught. Like, you can teach this, but some people are just born with it. A lot of Russians have it. I'm not sure why. Maybe it has to do with hunting in cold temperatures. I'm not sure. But we have a lot of famous Russian snipers from World War I and II, right?
Yeah.
Also, and not just Russians, a lot of people from the Icelandic Iceland and Norway and Denmark and countries like that.
Sweden, yeah.
Well, in any case, I mean, we get told these silly things as children, and so when 30 years down the road, we meet a Chinese teacher and he tells us, oh, you can control the movement and the energetics of your kidneys. Right. And some silly voice inside our head from when we were like 10 years old tells us, no, that's not possible. Because science says it's not possible. Well, the doctor was not practicing Bagua Zhang, so how would he know, right?
Right. It was just something that he was completely ignorant of, so how would he know? And then you meet someone that can do it, and you're like, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. And you know what else? I used to be a weight training instructor at the gym many years ago, and I would read a lot of scientific literature about weight training. So the main problem with those sorts of studies is that the majority of them are done with people with less than 3 months of training. Now, the reason being is that the researchers, most of whom are not that fit, obviously, they want to be objective. So they take people from they tend to take people, from the same geographical area, preferably if they can from oftentimes the same race or the same ethnicity. So it would be more uniform, not because of racist issues, of course, just to make it less, to make the study less biased, to see that it works. Certain protocols work a certain way for certain populations, age groups, men and women, etc. But then what they often do is they take complete beginners, and the problem is that with any type of physical practice, whomever you take who's a complete beginner is going to see extreme and dramatic improvements that are not going to be seen in anybody who is not a complete beginner. So famously, it was said, I think this appeared in the book Starting Strength by Mark Ripto, where he said, if you take like this scrawny kid who's 13 years old, hasn't done any type of physical training ever, they're gonna get such amazing gains that even if you let them just ride bicycle, that's gonna improve their bench press. Anything they do whatsoever in terms of physical training is just gonna get them stronger and better overall, because they were so weak to begin with. And so it's not just with fitness training. A lot of scientific studies about what the human body can do are with these so-called neutral, unbiased populations of people who can do very little to begin with, and then they're trying to teach them to do something, and lo and behold, there are results. They never take the guy who's been weightlifting, 30 years, or someone who's been doing martial arts for 50 years. These guys are not interesting because they are the so-called outliers. They can't get enough of these people to do research with 10,000 participants.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So we get a lot of bad ideas about martial arts coming in from science. We want to be modern and we want to bring science into the martial arts, but we don't pay attention to the fact that there's a lot of bad science that we shouldn't be applying to what we're doing.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Like, how are you going to get a real scientific perspective with someone that's completely oblivious to the greater practice of it, and the deeper levels of it? If someone is just learning something from a very superficial level, they're not going to be able to understand or even feel or study something scientifically with any depth if they're only skimming the surface.
Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with studies about acupuncture and herbalism. So what happens in acupuncture, they say, oh, this point is supposed to do this. So they take a researcher who really has no qualifications doing acupuncture, and the researcher comes and then they put a needle in this point or that point. Well, first of all, they're not necessarily qualified to even locate the point well anatomically. But assuming they could, okay, they put a needle in. That's one type of needle technique, and there are at least 18 common types of needle techniques, including twisting the needle clockwise or counterclockwise, bringing the needle up and down, making almost like a hooking movement with the needle. There's all sorts of ways to use needles, not to mention the use of moxa on the needle, without the needle, putting the needle through something like a piece of ginger. There's so many methods to use needles to get certain results, and the way you're going to use the needle depends on the person. Every person is different. So you get this research about acupuncture that's actually, it wants to be unbiased, but it's actually very biased. And then with herbs, what they do is they take a herb and they say, oh, this must be the active component. Let's take out the active component and study that. Well, like someone said once, and I can't recall who wrote this. It's a brilliant quote. They said, this is basically using the intelligence of the plant, but forgetting about its wisdom. Using the intelligence of the plant and forgetting about its wisdom. And what happens is that also these formulas are supposed, the herbs often work in formulas, and the formulas create like a community of action, right? And one of the things I learned from my teacher and mentor, Professor Stephen Jakovitz, is that why is it that you have so many bacteria that develop resistance to antibiotics, but you don't have any bacteria that has yet to develop resistance to traditional Chinese formulas. So if the formula is supposed to work for a certain strain of bacteria, it still works 2,000 years later. There's a formula. I just saw a Western populist scientist, Dan Ariely. He said, you need $4,000 to save an African child from malaria. $4,000 to save an African child from malaria. Well, the Chinese had a formula, xiao chai hu tang, over 2,000 years ago, I think it's that old, that's used for malaria. And today in the United States, a dose that would last you 3 weeks costs $10. And that's in the United States. And,
Yeah.
and why is it that the malaria has, which is different types of bacteria, why haven't they developed resistance to the formula? Because if there's only a single compound and the antibiotic that's very specific to single compound, the bacteria can adjust its genetic makeup to counter that one compound. But if several compounds, many actually, like dozens or hundreds of different compounds acting on it together, it cannot adjust, and that's why it cannot do it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's really it makes a lot of sense. And I think the reason for the isolation is in modern pharmaceuticals is they're just trying to create a patent for a profit.
Yes,
really.
Exactly.
And that's why it's lacking in a lot of regards from actual herbalism. They're taking down the natural healing component to create something that they can profit from.
And people, for instance, now they're taking curcumin. It comes from the active component in turmeric. Hey, fellas, you got turmeric in your kitchen. You can just cook that, and you get the whole package. And then they say, oh no, but you need some black pepper to make it like 2,000 times more, at 2,000% more potent, blah blah blah, or more absorbent. So just put the black pepper inside. Don't buy those pills. Damn it.
Exactly. Keep it simple.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've been talking for quite a while, and I want to ask you this one final question, which I think is very important. So you've been teaching for many years, and I would like to learn, how have you combined, the best aspects of approaches to instruction and practice from the various teachers you had in the modality with which you teach nowadays?
Oh, wow. Great question. I have just kind of really enjoy working with people in a personable, kind of a friendly level, where I can demonstrate something and have them show me and really understand a concept. I like to have fun with my students, but I also like to make sure that they are learning and training hard and learning something really practical. So as far as what kind of training methods and everything, I'm a pretty relaxed instructor. I'm not very militant at all with my approach, but I do like to keep things structured. I kind of, a lot of the things that I learned from Yang Shifu, I like to create a structured progression where Yang Shifu had taken different things and we kind of learned a little bit all over the map. And I really like to take that material and create a progressive structured format so that it's easier for students to learn, and so that they have a better perspective of what they're learning and can understand it without as much kind of abstraction, so they can feel it and experience it. And I really love taking students that have either like no martial arts experience and wanting to learn something authentic and learn how to protect themselves and make themselves healthier. But I also love teaching experienced martial arts practitioners and like showing them connections and more depth than they really understood before. I really love seeing the lights go on, and my inspiration for the martial arts helped light up a new fire for them to get a deeper understanding. And that's what I love doing the most, is just helping people find that deeper connection and deeper level and more well-rounded depth in their own practice. And I love inspiring people. So
That's wonderful, man. And
Yeah.
if people would like to experience those wonderful traditions and instruction that you have to offer, how can they find you?
The easiest way is just through my website. It's macemartialarts.com, just one word, MACE martialarts.com. And I have connections on multiple social media, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and etc. So, and I'm trying to create a platform with the progressive instruction I have, because I am wanting to develop like a instructional video and everything as well. So
Terrific. So we'll be sure to follow up. And I would like to thank you very, very much for coming on the podcast. It's been an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. I'm honored, and I'd love to continue the conversation sometime and train in person when we eventually can. That would be a blast. I'd love it. So
yes, most definitely. Yes, and we'll keep in touch, and hopefully we can have you on the podcast again in the future.
I'd love it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll see you around next time.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
See ya.
Well, let me tell you, this interview sure got us into interesting places, didn't it? If you are interested in learning more about traditional martial arts in general, and Chinese traditional martial arts in particular, you are more than welcome to go on your favorite Amazon website and search for one of my best-selling books, such as Research of Martial Arts, or The Martial Arts Teacher, And hey, don't forget, tap that subscribe button, alright? Because there are many more interviews and lectures coming, and you can go on the channel and look at the playlists and listen to the previous ones already published. See you around next time.